I never imagined that handing my daughter the keys to her dream home would be the last act of love she would ever thank me for. I was still smiling when she took those keys right out of my hand. Her husband standing behind her with an expression I can only describe as satisfied, the way a man looks when he has gotten exactly what he wanted without having to ask twice. The envelope in my purse held the final wire transfer confirmation. $182,000. My retirement. My late husband's life insurance. 31 years of careful, deliberate saving. Reduced to a single transaction for a 4-bedroom craftsman in a neighborhood I would never be welcome to visit unannounced. I know that now. I didn't know it then. My name is Margaret, and I am 63 years old. I raised one daughter on a school librarian's salary after my husband, Robert, passed from a heart attack when she was 17. I worked summers. I tutored on weekends. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it because every spare dollar went into an account I labeled simply for her future. When she graduated college debt-free, I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home alone. When she got engaged to a man named Derek at 31, I told myself, all that sacrifice had been worth it. I told myself that right up until the Saturday morning, 6 months after the closing, when I drove 40 minutes to surprise her with fresh blueberry muffins, and found the lockbox on the front door had been changed. My key no longer worked. I stood on that porch in the October cold, muffins in hand, and knocked like a stranger. My daughter came to the door in her robe, her face cycling through guilt and irritation, before settling on something practiced and calm. "Mom, you really should call first," she said. "Derek and I need our space." I looked past her shoulder at the living room I had helped furnish, the hardwood floors I had helped pay for, the bay windows we had admired together in the listing photos, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous. Clarity. I drove home with the muffins still warm in the passenger seat, and I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. I had simply chosen the comfortable blindness that mothers sometimes wrap around themselves like a second skin. Derek had been charming when they first started dating, attentive, polished, quick with compliments. He called me Margaret with a warmth that felt genuine, asked about my work, remembered small details I had mentioned in passing. My daughter glowed around him, and I thought that was enough. The first crack appeared 8 months into their engagement. They had been renting an apartment together, and Derek's company had announced layoffs. My daughter called me one Sunday evening, her voice tight in the way it gets when she wants something but doesn't want to ask directly. She said they were worried about the housing market, that prices were only going up, that if they waited any longer, they might never be able to afford a real home. She said Derek's parents had already given them $40,000 toward the down payment. I asked what they needed from me. She said $80,000 would cover the rest of the down payment and leave them a small cushion for closing costs and initial repairs. I asked if Derek was still employed, and she said yes, his division had been spared. I asked about their savings, and she gave me a number that was smaller than I expected for 2 people who had been working for nearly a decade. I did not ask where their money had gone. I told her I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I looked at my accounts and realized that giving her $80,000 would leave me comfortable but not secure. What I did next I am not proud of, in the way that mothers are never proud of giving more than they should. I pulled from the principle of Robert's life insurance. I restructured my own retirement timeline. I gave her $102,000 and told her it was my gift to her future. She cried on the phone. She said she didn't know how to thank me. She said I was the most generous person she had ever known. 4 months later, at the closing table, Derek leaned over and whispered to my daughter, and they exchanged a small private smile that I was not meant to see. At the time, I thought it was happiness. Now I understand it was something else entirely. The lockbox incident was the beginning of what I can only call a slow erasure. Invitations to dinner became less frequent. When I did come over, Derek would disappear into his office within the hour, and my daughter would begin checking her phone with the distracted energy of someone waiting for permission to end a conversation. She stopped asking my advice. She stopped calling just to talk. When Mother's Day passed with only a text message, I told myself she was busy. When Christmas dinner was cut short because Derek's family was waiting, I told myself that was simply how marriages worked. You made room for the other family. What I did not tell myself, because I was not ready to hear it, was that I had funded a life I was no longer a part of. The morning everything changed was a Thursday in March. I had been going through my email and found a notification I almost deleted. One of those automatic alerts my bank sends for account activity, except I had not authorized any account activity. The alert was for a credit inquiry, a hard pull on my credit report, the kind that happens when someone applies for a loan using your information. I called my bank immediately. The representative was calm and professional as she walked me through what she could see. Someone had attempted to open a home equity line of credit against my own property, my house, the house Robert and I had paid off together in 2019. The application had been flagged by their fraud detection system and paused pending verification, but the inquiry was real, and the applicant's contact information on file was not mine. I asked her to read me the phone number they had used. It was my daughter's cell phone. I sat very still for a long time after I hung up. The birds outside were making an unreasonable amount of noise for a Thursday morning. I noticed the coffee in my mug had gone cold. I noticed the small ceramic cardinal on my windowsill that Robert had bought me at a farmer's market 20 years ago. Its painted eye catching the light in a way that suddenly seemed very tender and very far away. Then I opened my laptop and started making calls of my own. My attorney is a woman named Claire, who has handled my estate planning since Robert passed. She is efficient and precise, and she does not waste words. When I explained what I had found, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Margaret, I need you to listen carefully and not contact either of them until we have spoken in person." I was in her office by 2 o'clock that afternoon. Claire had already pulled the credit inquiry report by the time I arrived. The application was incomplete, stopped before it could be fully processed. But the intent was clear. Someone had used my full legal name, my social security number, my property address, and my daughter's contact information to attempt to borrow against the equity in my paid-off home without my knowledge or consent. "This is identity fraud," Claire said, in the same tone she might use to describe rain in the forecast. Matter of fact, unavoidable. I asked her if she was certain. She turned the report toward me and pointed to the fields line by line. My name, my number, not my phone, not my signature. "You have 2 options," she said. "You report this, and we involve law enforcement, or you confront them privately and attempt to resolve it before it reaches that threshold." She paused. "I strongly recommend the former." I thought about my daughter's face on the day I handed her that closing gift check. I thought about the blueberry muffins on the porch. I thought about the ceramic cardinal and Robert and 31 years of saving. "Send the freeze to all 3 bureaus today," I said, "and draft whatever documentation I need to protect my property." Claire nodded once and reached for her phone. By the time I arrived home that evening, my credit was frozen across all 3 major bureaus. A formal dispute had been filed with my bank, and Claire had sent a certified letter to both my daughter and my son-in-law, informing them that their contact information had been found on a fraudulent financial application and that legal action was being considered. She had copied the local district attorney's office. I turned my phone off and slept better than I had in months. My daughter called 11 times the following morning. I watched the notifications stack up on my screen like an accusation in reverse and did not answer a single one. At 10:47, she sent a text that read, "Mom, please pick up. This is a misunderstanding. Derek just made a mistake. Please don't do anything until we talk." At 11:15, Derek sent one that said only, "Margaret, call us. This can all be explained." I found that interesting, that after 6 months of needing to call first, of being reminded to respect their space, of being quietly removed from the daily texture of their lives, they now needed me to pick up immediately. I called Claire instead. We met again that afternoon, and she showed me what her paralegal had found after a deeper look into their financial activity. My daughter and Derek had been carrying a significant amount of debt, credit cards run up over 2 years, a personal loan Derek had taken before they met, and a car lease on a vehicle that cost more per month than my first mortgage payment. The $40,000 Derek's parents had contributed to the house had actually come in the form of a loan from his father, not a gift, meaning they owed it back with informal interest. They had stretched far beyond their means to purchase the life they wanted, and when the cracks began to show, they had apparently looked at my paid-off home and seen a resource that belonged to them. "She grew up watching you manage money carefully," Claire said quietly. She knew exactly what that house was worth. I did not cry in her office. I am not sure why. Perhaps I had already done that crying somewhere private, in the way that grief sometimes does its work without your permission. When I finally responded to my daughter, it was through Claire. A formal letter stating that I was aware of the fraudulent application, that my credit had been frozen, and my property formally protected, and that any further unauthorized use of my personal information would result in criminal charges. The letter also included a request, not a demand, but a formal written request, for repayment of the $102,000 I had contributed to their home purchase. Given that the relationship of trust under which that gift had been made had been materially violated, the response came 48 hours later, not from my daughter but from Derek's lawyer. The letter was 3 pages of legal language that essentially accused me of emotional manipulation, financial coercion, and what his attorney described as a pattern of controlling behavior toward my daughter throughout her adult life. It claimed the gift had been freely given with no conditions attached, and that my current actions constituted harassment. It suggested I seek mental health support. I read it twice, set it on my kitchen table, and called Claire. "Good," she said when I read her the relevant portions. "That means they're scared." What I had not anticipated was my daughter's next move. That same afternoon, she posted on Facebook a photograph of herself looking tired and sad, accompanied by a caption that described a mother who had spent a lifetime using money as a weapon, who had never respected her daughter's marriage, who had now crossed a line that could not be uncrossed by filing false legal claims out of jealousy and spite. The post did not name me. It did not need to. Every person in our shared social circle understood exactly who she meant. The comments filled within the hour. Friends I had known since my daughter was in elementary school, women I had organized school fundraisers with, neighbors who had watched her grow up. They were all there in the comment section, offering sympathy and condolences and gentle indignation on her behalf. One woman wrote that she had always sensed something was off about our relationship. Another said she admired my daughter's courage for speaking out. I read every comment once, and then I put my phone in my desk drawer. My neighbor Frances found me in the backyard that afternoon, pulling weeds that did not need pulling. She is 71 and has the particular quality of knowing when to speak and when to simply sit nearby. She brought 2 glasses of iced tea and sat on the garden bench while I worked, and after a while she said, "You don't have to explain anything to me." I sat back on my heels and looked at her. "I know who you are," she said. "I watched you raise that girl alone. I know what it cost you." I did not cry then either. But it was close. The legal process moved with the particular slow momentum of institutions that take fraud seriously. Claire filed the formal complaint with the district attorney's office, which triggered an investigation. My son-in-law's attorney sent 2 more letters, increasingly aggressive, and Claire responded to each one with the patient precision of someone who has won these arguments before. My daughter stopped posting on Facebook after Claire sent a separate cease and desist letter, noting that the posts constituted defamation and that screenshots had been preserved. What I had not expected was the phone call from Derek's mother. She called on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying the careful pleasantness of someone who has rehearsed what they plan to say. She told me she was sure this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She told me that Derek was under enormous pressure at work and that sometimes people made poor decisions under stress. She told me that my daughter loved me very much and that it would be a shame to let a legal dispute damage that relationship permanently. Then she said, "You know how children are. They take things for granted when they're young. But you're the mother. You're the one with the perspective to step back and be gracious. I let her finish. Then I said, very quietly, that I had been gracious for 6 months while my key stopped working and my phone calls went unreturned. I had been gracious when Christmas dinner ended early and Mother's Day passed with a text message. I had extended grace until someone used my name and my social security number to attempt to steal equity from the home my late husband and I had spent 20 years paying off. I told her that my capacity for grace had reached its natural limit. She did not call again. My daughter and I finally spoke on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after Claire's first letter. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered before I could think better of it. Her voice was different from the Facebook posts and the attorney letters. Smaller, more like the voice of the girl who used to sit on the kitchen counter while I made soup and tell me about her day. She said she was sorry. I did not say anything. She said Derek had told her the credit inquiry was just research, that he had been exploring options and had used my information without fully thinking through what he was doing. She said she had not known about it until Claire's letter arrived. She said she should have called me immediately when the locks were changed to explain that Derek needed privacy to work from home, and it hadn't been about me personally. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Did you know about the debt?" A long pause. Then, "Some of it. Did you know when you asked me for the money?" Another pause, longer. "We were going to pay it off. Derek was up for a promotion. I asked if he had gotten the promotion. She said no." The silence between us stretched out into something that felt almost physical. I could hear her breathing. I thought about the 17-year-old girl who had sat in the front pew at her father's funeral and not cried because she was too busy holding my hand. I thought about how hard it is to become the wrong version of the person you raised. I told her I needed time. I told her I was not prepared to have this conversation yet, and that when I was, it would need to happen in person, with a clear accounting of what had occurred and what she was prepared to do to make it right. She said she understood. She said she would wait. After I hung up, I sat at Robert's old desk in the study, and I wrote 3 pages in the journal I had started keeping after Frances suggested it. I wrote about the version of my daughter I had believed in so completely that I had missed the one standing right in front of me. I wrote about the particular grief of loving someone whose choices you cannot excuse. I wrote about Robert and how much I wished he were here, not to fix anything, but simply to sit with me in the middle of it. The investigation took 11 weeks in total. At the end, the district attorney's office determined there was sufficient basis for charges, but offered a diversion program, which meant that if Derek completed a financial counseling requirement and made restitution, formal charges would not be pursued. Claire called it the best realistic outcome. I agreed. Not because I felt merciful, but because I was tired of the whole thing consuming my days. The restitution was not the full $102,000. It was $40,000, structured as a formal repayment agreement with monthly installments. Claire said we could have pushed for more, but that collecting the full amount would have required forcing the sale of the house, which was technically possible, but would have taken years and left everyone worse off. I accepted the $40,000. It was not about the money by then. It was about the acknowledgement that something real had been taken. My daughter signed the agreement herself. Derek signed it too, without his attorney in the room. Claire told me later that he had looked like a man who had finally understood the full dimensions of what he had done. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard that. I mostly felt tired. What happened next, I did not plan and could not have predicted. One of my former colleagues, a woman named Patricia, who taught English at the same school for 22 years, shared something on her Facebook page. I never learned exactly what or how, but somehow a version of my story, stripped of names and identifying details, began circulating in an online community for older women. Within 2 weeks, I had 47 emails from strangers, all variations on the same theme. Daughters who had taken too much, sons whose spouses had redirected the family's financial gravity away from the woman who had built it, mothers who had given everything and then found themselves standing on porches, keys that no longer worked in their hands, wondering where they had gone wrong. I read every single one. I answered as many as I could. A woman named Rose wrote from somewhere in Tennessee to say she had been supporting her son and his wife for 3 years, paying their utilities and groceries, while they took 2 vacations per year, and that reading about someone finally saying enough had made her sit down and write her own letter that she had been drafting in her head for 18 months. She asked if it was too late for her. I wrote back and told her it was never too late to become the person who protects themselves. She wrote again a month later to say she had mailed the letter. I kept both of her notes in the journal. The conversation with my daughter, the real one, happened on a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between her house and mine. She arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in, her hands around a mug, her posture careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed stillness. She looked like herself again, less polished than she had been in the Derek years, a little tired around the eyes, but more present somehow, more like the girl I recognized. We talked for 2 hours. I asked her to tell me, honestly, when she had started thinking of my savings as something she could access. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said she didn't think it had been a single moment. She said Derek had a particular way of framing things, of describing my financial security as excessive for one person, of suggesting that money sitting in a retirement account was somehow selfish when family needed it. She said she had let herself believe it because it was easier than confronting how stretched they were. I asked if she had loved Derek or the life she thought he would give her. She looked at me with an expression I will not forget. Both, she said, and I confused them for the same thing for a long time. We did not hug when we left. But she walked to my car with me, and before I got in, she said, "I am genuinely sorry, Mom. Not sorry we got caught. Sorry I let him change how I saw you." I told her I heard that and that it would take time. She said she knew. She said she would be there when I was ready. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold. I retired properly that spring, 2 years earlier than I had originally planned, made possible in part by the careful restructuring Claire and I had done of my remaining assets. I took a part-time position 2 mornings a week at the public library, shelving and reading groups, which I had always loved and which cost me nothing in dignity. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I had meant to do since Robert passed and had never gotten around to. I bought myself a car that was less than 10 years old for the first time since my daughter was in middle school. The repayment installments arrived every month, on time, which I did not expect. I deposited each one into a separate account I labeled New Chapter. I did not touch it. I did not entirely know what it was for. It felt important to let it accumulate without a plan. Frances and I began taking long walks on Sunday mornings, 2 or 3 miles through the neighborhood, talking about everything and nothing. She told me once that watching me navigate the past year had reminded her that dignity is not the absence of being hurt. It is what you do with yourself while you are healing. I thought about that for a long time. My daughter and I began having dinner together once a month, cautiously at first, then with more ease as the months passed. Derek was not present at these dinners. They had separated in the spring, not because of the legal situation specifically, but because once the pressure of maintaining a certain image had been removed, they discovered they did not have much holding them together. She was living in a smaller apartment, managing her own finances for the first time in years, and she had started seeing a therapist. She mentioned this almost shyly, as if she expected me to make something of it. I told her I thought it was one of the best decisions she had made in a long time. She laughed, briefly, and for a moment, she sounded exactly like herself at 14. What I know now, that I did not know when I stood on that porch with cold muffins in my hands, is that love is not the same thing as unlimited access. Generosity is not the same thing as surrender. I had raised my daughter to understand that hard work and integrity were the foundation of a life worth living. And then I had quietly undermined that lesson every time I wrote a check to smooth over a consequence. I had not meant to do it. I had meant to love her. But somewhere in the gap between what I intended and what I enabled, she had learned the wrong things about what money meant and what mothers were for. I cannot fix all of that. I am not sure I was ever supposed to. What I can do is live the rest of my life in a way that demonstrates something different, that a woman of 63 with a half-empty retirement account and a 10-year-old car that she has finally replaced, can still wake up on a Tuesday morning and feel that her life belongs to her, that the things she has built have value that cannot be withdrawn or repaid or contested in any court. Last October, I drove the 40 minutes to my daughter's new apartment for her birthday. I brought a small cake and a book I thought she would like, and I knocked on her door like someone who had been expected and was welcome. She opened it right away. The apartment was modest and a little cluttered, and there were her own things on every surface, chosen by her, arranged the way she wanted them. Not Derek's taste or anyone else's. She hugged me in the doorway for a long moment. We sat at her kitchen table and ate cake and talked until it was dark outside. She asked about the watercolor class. I showed her a photo on my phone of the small painting I had done of the cardinal on my windowsill. Still rough, still learning its own edges. But mine, she said it was beautiful. I told her I thought so too. I still have the journal. I write in it most evenings, just a few lines. The small account of an ordinary day, what I planted in the garden, what Francis said on our walk, a passage from whatever I am reading, the light on the water when I drove past the reservoir on my way home from the library. Small things, real things, things that belong entirely to me. There's a line I wrote in it some months ago that I return to when the old doubts come visiting, as they still sometimes do. I wrote, "The most expensive thing I ever gave away was not money. It was the belief that my love had to be unlimited to count for anything. The day I stopped giving that away was the day I finally had enough left for myself." I think Robert would have agreed.